Greetings, everyone showing up today for our virtual meeting. We're going to get started in just a minute or two. We're going to let a few more people join our call today, and then we're going to get going. So I will be back in just a minute or two, and we'll get going. Well, welcome everybody. It is June 1st, 2022. I can't believe it. I am Michael Van Heist, Vice President of Missio Nexus, and I want to thank you for joining us today for our Church Mission Leader peer-to-peer virtual event. My co-host is my friend, as always, Matthew Ellison, the president of 1615. Hey, Matthew, how are you doing today?
Michael, it's great to see you. You know, I love hanging out with you, man.
It's always good to hang out with you and talk especially about church missions. And
Amen.
we're going to be able to do a good amount of that today, I think.
Yep.
So, all right. Well, let me take care of some housekeeping items. Then Matthew's going to be back here in just a second. If you can mute your mics and turn off your camera, it's going to help with today's recording. So thank you for doing that. And just a reminder, the focus of these events is for church mission leaders. And so if you're joining us from an agency today, put on your church hat. And we would just ask that you don't run any advertising through your Zoom presence today. That would be great. And after the presentation today, we're going to have some ongoing interaction through the presentation, but we're also going to have Q&A at the end. And as always, if you have questions, just pop those in the chat box. We're going to keep track of those, and Matthew's going to be able to use those questions later in the program today. We want to give special thanks to our sponsor, Brotherhood Mutual Insurance Company. No matter where your mission takes you, travel insurance is essential for covering unexpected events in the mission field. And Brotherhood Mutual and Fly for Good have joined forces to create Faith Ventures, a mission-focused organization that provides mission travelers with travel insurance and affordable airfare. So check out brotherhoodmutual.com for more information. Our next church mission leader peer-to-peer will be on August 3rd, so we're going to skip over July. Our next one's going to be in August, and it's going to be with my friend Pastor Mimsy Robinson of Bethel Gospel Assembly in Harlem, New York. You're going to learn a lot from an amazing church that was started by a missionary, and as a church has missions as a core part of their DNA of who they are. I'm always inspired by Mimsy and the work that his church is doing in New York City and around the globe. So please don't miss that on August 3rd. Well, the calling to be a mission pastor is an amazing privilege and responsibility, but it also can be an incredibly difficult one. I remember the time I was a missions pastor, I had great moments and I had some hard moments. Getting people to care deeply about people and places outside of our orbit of first-hand relationships takes a lot of information and inspiration. And not only do mission pastors need to know how to work skillfully with lead pastors, since mobilizing people well in a church requires their voice and influence, they need to navigate the complexities of working in partnership with missionaries and mission agencies and field partners, and the list goes on and on. So if you're a missions pastor or leader in your church, today is especially geared for you, as we have Justin Mack, who's the global project pastors at River Valley Church in Minnesota, here to speak to us. And Justin has been there for the last 15 years, and River Valley has grown to be one of the leading missions giving and sending churches in America. In fact, last year, the church raised over $10 million for a variety of mission efforts. It currently supports over 1,000 long-term missionaries every month and has a vision to raise up 500 long-term missionaries from their local church. Prior to the pandemic, they were sending short-term teams somewhere in the world every single week, which is simply amazing. Justin has his undergraduate degree from Southwestern Assemblies of God University and a master's degree in missiology from Fuller Seminary. He's married with 3 young kids, and a few years ago also started Project 42, which raises awareness and resources for the 42% of the world that is still unreached. So Justin, go ahead and turn your camera on. It is great to have you with us today. And Matthew and Justin are going to work together over this next part here and go back and forth a little bit. So guys, I'm going to hand it over to you and look forward to this next segment.
Thank you, Michael. Well, Justin, I've been looking forward to this conversation today. We have a similar background. I've been a missions pastor in years past for about 10 years, probably not as long as you, but we have a similar experience in the church. And I remember when we met, I think it was last year. You know, the COVID era has confused time, and it gets it's hard to remember when things actually happened or didn't happen.
Right.
So, but the first time I met you, man, I got to tell you, my heart was just enlarged after our conversation. I think we planned on a 30-minute call, and it went a whole lot longer. And we just had a kindred spirit, a passion for God's glory, and a love to see the church mobilized and the nations won to Christ. So I am really excited to have this conversation with you today, brother.
Yeah, likewise. It's an honor to be on with this group of people. I was looking through the participant list here, and there's some amazing people on this call. And so it's just an honor to get to share a little of our story and the passion that's in our heart. So thanks for having me.
You know, Justin, maybe that's a great place to start. Maybe give a little background on yourself, how you ended up on mission with God, and your role at your church. That'd be a good place to begin.
Yeah. So I like to tell the joke that I'm a pastor. My last name is Mack, and I'm a dad. So that makes me Pastor Mack Daddy, which is a pretty cool title for a lot of different reasons. But I often say I wasn't the original Pastor Mack Daddy. My dad was a pastor and grew up in an amazing church family that really prioritized the Great Commission. In fact, my dad wasn't the original Pastor Mack Daddy. My grandpa was a pastor as well. And I remember as a kid hearing stories of missionaries around our dinner table or on Sunday night service, and was just really intrigued by the stories, the heart, the obedience of many missionaries. But for me, it became very personal. It moved from my head to my heart when I was 16, went on my first missions trip to Lima, Iquitos, Peru. And it was a fun experience, but I didn't know until many, many years later, looking back, how monumental, how life-changing, perspective shifting, heart moving that experience was going to be. But now when I look back, that was a pivotal moment in my worldview and in even God's plan for my life. He's taken me now to 60, 70 countries around the globe, and just the heart for the world has just continued to enlarge. Now at amazing church, been at River Valley Church for 15 years. Started here when it was a single site church, just a couple hundred people in a suburb of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And now it's a multi-site church. Pre-pandemic, we were running about 10,000 a weekend. I have no idea what we're running now. Hard to count, but really has a global heart and global vision to engage everyone in the Great Commission in one way or another.
You know, something else we have in common, Justin, I guess I didn't appreciate it, but my life trajectory was completely changed by my first short-term mission trip. I went to Ghana, West Africa, and at the end of about 45 days in field, everything within me said, yes, this is what you were made for. Yeah. And I look back on that memory as you said, a monumental time, a pivotal time. And I think that brings up something that's important, is that short-term missions have incredible value. They've got a bad rap, and it's probably been earned by a lot of short-term mission trips done poorly, but done properly, I think they have incredible value. Maybe we'll get to that later, but
Absolutely.
I think they have a place. We're not going to win the nations with short-term mission trips, but they can be a piece of a larger picture of discipling people into a global worldview. And if you serve those you're working with, they can actually benefit them as well. But we'll come back to that later. But I love that because that was my life changer. I mean, that was a game changer for me. So Michael already set the table. Being a missions pastor is not easy. In fact, as he talked about, you have to connect with your senior pastor because that's critical if you're going to cast church-wide vision. You have to have skills to understand mission agencies. You have to relate to missionaries. Man, my head is spinning when I think about all of the skill sets that a missions pastor would need. And so I thought of you when we were coming up with this topic here. We just said, let's boil it down to some of the essentials. What's a pocket guide to being an effective, fruitful missions pastor? And I asked you to identify 5 things. So let's just start with number 1, brother.
Yeah, you already touched on it. But I would say if I was talking to a new missions pastor, or maybe even a veteran, I think the first key, and you really touched on it, is you have to know the vision and the passion of your leadership. If it's a senior pastor-led context church, you really need to know what their passion is, what's their vision for the Great Commission. You don't want to be working against your leader. You want to be working in tandem, and that doesn't mean that you can't expand their thought. You can't encourage them, educate them, try to inspire them in your own respectful way. But you really do need to understand their passion and their vision for missions. I know for me, our lead pastor, Rob Ketterling, started the church 20-something years ago, almost 25 years ago now. And he was a missions major in college. So he had a passion. Often, I think that he's actually a missionary in disguise as a megachurch pastor, because his heart just beats for the nations, people that have never heard the gospel before. On Easter Sunday, he'll talk about raising up and sending out missionaries. I remember years ago sitting with a marketing executive, and we were just trying to figure out how can we communicate the missions vision within our church. It had gotten larger and multi-site, and we were just trying to convey the importance of the Great Commission to people within our church. And so we're meeting with this marketing executive, and the marketing executive asked, he said, I get it, as a lead pastor, you have to care about everything. You have to care about women's ministries, men's ministry, worship, preaching, small groups, missions, everything, And he goes, but I want to know for you and your church, how important is this global missions efforts? And our pastor is not typically lost for words, just put his fist on the table that we were sitting at and said, no, our heart is global. Like if you rip out our heart, you're going to see it beat for the nations. And that's a tagline that we give at our church, is like River Valley Church, our heart is global. And it's not just in words. It's not just a cliche phrase that we toss around. It's in our finances. It's in every department. It's woven into the fabric and the DNA of who we are and who we believe God has called us to be as a church. In fact, the bullseye of our church is not a number of campuses. It's not a number on the weekend. It's not even a numeric financial goal. It is raising up and sending out 500 missionaries to overseas global missions work. And so that comes from the vision and the heart of our lead pastor. So my role as a missions pastor is just keeping up with his vision, to just pour more gasoline on the fire that already exists in his heart. And I know that that's not normal. I know that that's not the case for everyone. But he tells me, just keep pouring the gasoline on. And so if I can dream it, if I can imagine it, he's going to figure out how to fund it and figure out how to get behind it. But that's my context. You have to know the context of your lead pastor or the elders or whatever your context is. Know the passion and vision of leadership was probably the first thing that I would encourage people to understand and know.
Yeah, of course I concur. I'm working on a book right now that revolves around this topic, as you know. I see the neon sign in the back right there, Our Heart is Global. So clearly missions is a part of your discipleship identity as a church. Now, I imagine there's a lot of people online that don't have that. That missions is an addendum that is stapled on to, Christianity. They don't have the senior pastor who's a missions champion. This is a tough question, brother, but how do you influence that pastor? I can't tell you how many times I've talked to missions pastors and they say, how do I get my senior pastor to really champion the cause of missions? Any words of wisdom for that person that is running up against a barrier? Any thoughts?
Yeah, the second thing that actually on the list here that I wrote down is be a learner. And I think that's important, to be a learner of your leader. Is how do you communicate effectively with them? My lead pastor has very limited time. There's just so many people that want his time and attention. And so I've had to learn how to very concisely and quickly present information and inspire him to care about the thing that I'm caring about. And I think sharing stories, sharing statistics, giving context, educating. There's so much that a lead pastor has to consume. But if you are a missions voice in your church, a pastor on staff, a key leader, a volunteer, there's a reason you're in that spot. And I would say that they've actually picked you. So there's a level of trust. You just have to earn greater trust. You have to earn greater influence. And so I'm constantly telling him little anecdotes and stories and examples and statistics. And so the second thing I would just tell somebody is be a constant learner and take a posture of humility to say, I don't care how long I've been doing this. I don't care how many books I've read, how many places I've been. I'm constantly asking missionaries and missions leaders what trends they're seeing, what problems they're facing, what principles are we not employing in our own context, or that I maybe heard before but forgotten, and then passing that on to my leadership so that he's as connected to what we're doing as anyone is connected. And then a number of years ago, I just felt like I was in over my head. We were into the multiple millions and crisscrossing the globe. And so I did formal education where I went to Fuller Seminary and studied intercultural studies or missiology, however you want to say it. But so I think there's informal learning, but then formal learning. But with that comes some credibility. So I've earned the trust of our leader, where he now defers a lot of the judgment and the decision making to me. But that's not come overnight. It's a long game. It's 15 years of relationship and earning trust and following through with what I'm going to say and do. So it's a long road. Don't give up. Keep pressing. Keep putting fuel on the fire.
Be a constant learner. You talked about a posture of humility. One of the things that I've talked to missions pastors and leaders over the years that have struggled with this, I've said to them, you have to wear your convictions with brokenness and tears. Yeah. If you wear your passions and convictions with haughtiness or condescension, you're not going to win the ear of your pastor at all. So you don't want to be, we talk about the holy annoyer, you need to be a tempered holy annoyer. It's okay to be a holy annoyer, but you got to be tempered. You got to know timing. You have to have that posture of grace and humility. We were at the Missions Leaders Conference last year, the Missio Nexus puts on, and we did a pastor's panel, and we had missions leaders in the room. And one person on the panel said something profound at the end. They said, look, if you want to win the heart of your pastor for missions, practice the contextualization skills you do in field with your pastor. And exactly what you said, empathy, learning. I was reminded of 1 Peter 3:7. I know this is husbands and wives, but bear with me here. Husbands, be considerate as you dwell with your wives. Considerate means to study her. And so study your pastor, learn your pastor. And then, I just thought of that when you were mentioning it. I think that is just so important. Your posture goes so far. If you don't have the right posture, no matter what you say, he's not going to listen.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Matt. Form your thoughts in the phrase of a question, in the form of a question, because you can sound very condescending. You can
Yep.
come across very ignorant, because you don't know all the things that they have to deal with, all the pressures that they have. And so I've learned to just ask a lot of questions, and they may be leading questions, and I'll be unashamed about that. But like, would you consider, or have you thought about, or what if we tried this, or what if we tried that? Because it doesn't put him in a corner. It allows him to add to it, or ask a question back, or dive in a little bit. But I also would say, to your point of humility and just a posture of brokenness, there are a lot of things that we can assume people know, including our leader, that they've never heard before. They haven't read what you read. They haven't heard the stories you've heard necessarily. And so I know the analogy. I talked to one missionary who's just an incredible influencer, but his tone would often come across very almost angry. And I asked him a question one day. I said, first time you told your kids to pick up their bedroom, were you angry, or were you patient and, you'd take a posture of a teacher? He said, well, of course, they didn't know any better. I said, there's a lot of people in our church, they don't know the disproportionate use of resources, reaching the unreached. They don't know about the number of unreached people groups. They don't know about a lot of these things. So if we're angry at them, or we're frustrated with them, they're like, why are you so frustrated with me? I didn't even know about this. But I read a survey one not long ago that said somebody has to hear something 17 times for them to finally hear it. Well, that means your lead pastor, your leadership may need you to repeat it patiently and kindly and humbly over a dozen times before it actually starts to sink into their heart and sink into their head. So yeah, that's a very key point, is be a learner.
Well, I really appreciate that. I just want to speak to those online right now. If you're in that situation where you're not in alignment necessarily with your pastor, or he's not a champion for missions, that concept of asking questions, ask profound questions, generative questions, that's gold right there, Justin. Thank you so much. So we've got 2 L's here. We've got leadership and learning. What's your third one? I might have set you up. Maybe there's no alliteration here, but anyway.
There's no alliteration.
Okay.
We're done with the L's.
All right.
The third one is just try to create a reproducible model. I remember when we were trying to figure out, how do we engage people's heart in the Great Commission? We don't want this just to be a departmental thing. We want our kids, we want our youth, we want our young, we want our old engaged in this Great Commission. And we had a number of great missionaries that were doing incredible things around the world. And we were just wanting to give a window into their world and for people to understand what's going on. And so we tried to do a missions trip, and it didn't go great. It was a struggle to get enough people on board. And I read a book called Freakonomics, where it would look at the opposite side of a problem. And sometimes the problem that you think exists is actually not the real problem. And so as I was reading this, I thought about the complexity of a missions trip, just a short-term missions trip. And I agree with you, Matt. I don't think that short-term missions trips are the end-all, be-all strategy of missions. But I also think if done well with a really good partner, it can be very catalytic. It can open eyes. It can move hearts, puts everything on the table. And so I do think if it's done well, it can be a very catalytic force in the church for Great Commission purposes. And so I'm thinking about all the factors that go into somebody joining one mission trip opportunity that the church puts out. The dates have to be perfect. The cost has to be something they can afford. They actually have to kind of like the team leader, because they don't want to go for 10 days with somebody that they don't enjoy being around. The type of ministry has to be somewhat relatable or approachable. If I'm not a teacher and the whole thing is preaching and teaching, that doesn't resonate. Or if I don't love kids, but it's all about kids, that's not going to resonate. And so I just thought, man, all the factors that have to line up for people to join one trip is tough. I wonder if we could scale it and just try 10 trips. And so I found 10 leaders. We had a model for one trip and just reproduced that 10 different times, picked 10 different dates. And 9 out of those 10 trips filled up within days of launching them. And I just figured out like this idea of like, man, we just have 10 different leaders that are recruiting. We have 10 different price points. We have 10 different groups. And we weren't a huge church. I think we were like 600 or 700 people at that time, which it's a large church, but it's not, mega thousands. And so we just multiplied and kept reproducing that missions trip model. And I think Michael said it before, but pre-pandemic, we were sending the team every single week somewhere in the world, and it is generating a passion for Great Commission work, both in giving and in going and in praying and in advocating. And so it started with figuring out how are we going to do one trip and now reproduce that over and over and over and over. But it can sound overwhelming, but it literally starts with what's your model for one trip? Now, how are you going to reproduce that over and over and over, maybe 3, 4, 5 times? How are you going to reproduce that one model of a trip? So I would say create a model that can be reproduced.
Great. So let me ask about resources in that arena. Are there books you could recommend? Because I imagine some of these people are starting from scratch. Maybe some have some short-term trips in place, but any recommended resources that would give them a framework or even a template that they would need to personalize and contextualize, but a template for a good experience?
Yeah, I would say the 3 most important elements, it's not a book, but to me, as I look at, so we've probably sent out several hundred trips. I mean, thousands of people have gone now. And the 3 things that I think are most important to a really successful short-term trip is a really good host that knows the context, knows the culture, knows how to use a group of volunteers within their context, where they're not just putting on another layer of paint. They're actually doing something that's going to help the community, that's going to help move the mission forward. So really good local host. We pretty much exclusively, with a few exceptions, we work with long-term missionaries. So we're not typically sending teams to organizations. We do on some occasion, but we work with boots on the ground, long-term missionaries that are living in the context. So I would say long-term missionary partner or organization that really knows how to host teams. That's number 1. Number 2 is a really good leader. And I often say that good leaders are not necessarily positional leaders. There are some great leaders in our organization that have high-level positions, but they're actually not a great influencer. They don't recruit real well. They're not very personal. So I'm looking for people that have spheres of influence that people want to be around, people want to spend time with, people want to hang out with. Because if that person goes, a group of people are going to follow them, and then we can train them. We have information we'd be happy to share with whoever, but none of it's copyrighted. It's all just free that we've stolen from books and different things that we've learned along the way. And then the last thing is pick what you're going to use for your process. So great host, great leader, and then process. We use managed missions. There's a lot of great tools out there. Managed missions, very affordable, very user-friendly for both administrator, team leader, and team participant. But you've got to have some sort of system. If it's all on a spreadsheet, it's going to get really crazy really fast if you try to scale it. But so I would say those 3 things is: are you picking really good leader or really good host? Do you have good leaders that are good influencers? And then a system that you have in place that will help you scale and keep things organized.
It's great, good stuff. And you put it out there. I was going to ask, but I didn't want to put you on the spot. He's willing to share some of these documents and resources with you. So thank you for that, Justin. Okay, let's move on to number 4.
Yeah, I would just say dream bigger. Our idea is not just engaging the people that are passionate about missions, but Jesus' last command to his followers were going to all the world, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. So it's not an either or proposition. And he wasn't saying that to a group of missionaries. He wasn't saying that to a group of elite. He was saying that to people that identified themselves as a follower. And so we want this Great Commission passion and vision in the heart of every single person in our church. If you say, I'm a follower of Jesus, we think that you should know your role and be a part of the Great Commission. Our little kids last year raised $130,000 to help missionaries. I know the other day, this was probably several months ago now, I was just driving with my son, William. He's 8 years old. We didn't have any music, nothing on in the car. And it's just quiet. And he says, Dad, like out of the silence of the car, he says, Dad, let's go rob a bank. And I was like, what in the world? I was like, I got some discipleship to do with my little buddy. But I kind of played along, and I was like, buddy, why do you want to rob a bank? He goes, well, that's where all the money is, right? And I said, well, some of it's ours, not much of it. Mostly it's other people's money. But I said, what would you do with that money if you could get that money? And he goes, I want to help as many missionaries as possible. Mm-hmm. And so obviously we got some discipleship about how to raise money and, entrepreneurial and all this kind of stuff. But I love the idea that a little kid in the silence of his own thoughts is thinking about creatively, how can I help missionaries? How can I do my part? And I don't think that's exclusive to William because he's missions pastor's son. I think there's a lot of little kids in our church. I think there's youth pastors, or youth in our church. There's young adults, there's young, old that are really taking their role in the Great Commission seriously. And so don't make it something that's exclusive to just a group of people. Say, how do we get this into every single person in our church? Young, old, single, couple, family, newer to Christ, been walking with the Lord for years and years and years. Dream big about engaging everyone. It's all of our part to be a part of the Great Commission.
Yeah, as you were sharing, a couple of quotes came to mind. I love storing up a lot of missionary quotes here, but F.B. Myers says, you never test the resources of God until you attempt the impossible. Right. So dream big, dream what it would look like to engage your whole body in this vision. Another one, this is from Kevin DeYoung. If we only look to and pray for the things we can do, then we're not aiming high enough. Yeah. So I just resonate with that. Dream big about what it would look like to engage your entire congregation in this incredible grand narrative of Scripture, the story of redemption. Maybe you could unpack a little bit of what it looks like to engage the different age groups in your church. Yeah. How do you get, from the little kids all the way to the seniors? Not everyone's going to go on a trip. Not everyone's going to go as a full-time worker. What does it look like to engage larger numbers for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. So anytime we'll have a missionary guest come in, whether they're speaking for the weekend or they're just given a 5-minute update spotlight, we would have them present on the biggest stage. And then immediately they would leave that stage and they would go to the kids' church and they're going to present to the kids. And one of the cultural or nuances we have is anytime a missionary steps on the stage at River Valley, we stand to honor them. And we're not standing to honor them just simply because they live in another country. We are honoring radical obedience, and we teach that that's something that we all should aspire to as a follower of Christ. Is what is he asking us to do? And the answer is yes, let's do it. Even if it means radical sacrifice, radical obedience is what we're going. So even when they go into the kids area, when a missionary walks in the room in our kids' church, every single little kid stands up and gives an applause. And then we talk about being radically obedient to whatever Jesus asked. So they're hearing the stories. We do the same thing with youth. We are constantly having missionary stories and missionary opportunities. And we challenge all of our kids, all of our youth to give generously and sacrificially. This is a crazy number, but it's true. Last year, our youth gave $600,000 to help missionaries last year. These are students in high school that gave $600,000. And people say, okay, well, it's about the money, but that's not what Jesus taught. Jesus taught his disciples, where you put your treasure, your heart's going to go that direction. So if it doesn't start with your finances, your heart's not going that direction. And so it has to involve the resources God has put into your hands, we believe. And what are you going to do with that? And that turns into prayers, that turns into going, that turns into learning more. When people are giving, they want to know where they're giving to. So then they start to inquire, they ask questions, and they read the books and the biographies. And so it starts with the resources that we put from the youngest to the oldest. So we don't make it just a big church thing. We embed it into kids. We try to make opportunities for kids to go on trips. The last lesson that I was going to throw out there is don't let your perceived limitations limit your impact. Or another way to say it is let your limitations force creativity. So pandemic hits, we shut down, we canceled 32 missions trips. And we said, everyone's on Zoom. Why don't we start zooming around the world and hearing stories of missionaries and what's going on? So we created a thing called virtual mission trips, where it was a 3-day format where for 3 consecutive mornings, for 3 hours each morning, we would zoom into a different part of the world. So my wife and I led the first one just as an experiment. We said, okay, we're going to zoom into Saudi Arabia, where we had some workers there, and then Iraq, where we had some workers. And about 30 people went with us via Zoom. So from their home, from their office, we all just hopped on Zoom, and we had some security briefing at the beginning and kind of laid the foundation of what they were going to need to be aware of going into the conversation. And then for about an hour, we just heard the story of the missionary. How did they end up in Iraq? How did they end up in Saudi Arabia? The next day, we did the exact same thing, and we learned about their context. So now tell us all about Basra, Iraq. Tell us all about Saudi Arabia, because most of us have never been there. And then the final day was, how do you present the gospel within that context? So what's your missiological strategy? So for 9 hours, we zoomed into these 2 different countries. At the end of it, I just asked the question, I don't know if this was valuable or not to you guys, but give me feedback, because we don't want to reproduce something that's not valuable. Tell us if this was good or not. And the first person that responded was a lady in her late 60s. She'd been all over the world in her life. And she says, this was the single best missions experience I've ever had. And I said, that's a very kind compliment, but I need you to unpack that, because I don't understand. I said, there's a lot of things that are lost via Zoom, but I need you to explain to me why you thought it was so valuable. And she goes, I've traveled, I've been there, but honestly, a lot of the time is just spent traveling, getting there and getting back. And a lot of time is spent eating, and a lot of time is spent sleeping. She goes, but for 9 hours, I heard story after story. I heard missiology layered on top of theology, layered on top of all these different things. And she goes, I have a better understanding of missions and the approach that we take now than I've ever had on any trip that I've ever taken. And light bulbs just went off in my mind. I was like, as a missions pastor, I get to hear a lot of stories and get to ask a lot of questions. But the average person sitting in our church doesn't get to have that opportunity to sit face to face with a veteran that's been on the field for a decade or 2 decades and ask the questions that are rolling in their mind. They just hear the sermon, or they hear the 5-minute presentation, and that's about it. And so we just gave them 9 hours of exposure that they otherwise would not typically have into a world that they probably would never go to. And so that's just one example of, man, what we thought was a limitation created some ingenuity or some creativity that now we've sent dozens and dozens and dozens of virtual teams, and they are incredibly impactful, way more than we ever thought on the front end of this pandemic. And we don't think it's going to stop. We think it's just going to continue.
Yeah, I love the power of story. I often go to Acts 14:27, where Paul and Barnabas and the missionary team returns back to Antioch, the very first sending church we read about in the New Testament, the very first one that took the gospel to the Gentiles. And it says they gathered the church and they rehearsed the work of the Holy Spirit and how the door of faith had been opened unto the Gentiles. And I tell people all the time, tell the story, the power of the narrative of the Holy Spirit working through your workers who wouldn't be on the field without the contribution of the sending church. Show the sending church their role in this larger picture. So if you're listening, what's one of the takeaways here, folks? Find a way to tell those compelling stories of what God is up to. I'm going to go off script here a little bit. Okay, if I can do that, Justin. You've completed your 5? Is there more?
No, that's it. That's all I got.
Well, it's a lot of good stuff. Okay. I want to talk about your missionaries, your long-term full-time workers in field. What does it look like to get to the field in your context? Maybe people who are online can glean some ideas. What does that trajectory look like to get to the field?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we see ourselves as being a support, not a sending agency. So one of our prerequisites is that anyone that's going long-term has to pick a reputable sending agency. We're affiliated with the Assemblies of God, and so a lot would go through Assemblies of God World Missions, but many would go with Pioneers or Frontiers or other sending agencies. But when we had this vision probably about 8-9 years ago to raise up and send out 500 missionaries, I was working on my master's at Fuller. And so I had a lot of contacts, professors, mission agency leaders, missionaries. And I started asking the one question that I was most curious about: what does it take to be successful long-term on the mission field? The goal isn't to send somebody out for a couple months or even a year. Like, we want a lifetime of service, should the Lord allow them and the doors continue to open. But what are the components? What are the principles? What's the foundation that needs to be laid for somebody to be successful long-term on the mission field? And so I just got tons of feedback from missionaries and agency leaders and professors and people that are way smarter than I am. And I just took it and aggregated the information and broke it down into 4 phases. So what we call the missionary action plan. It's a 4-phase self-guided process where they're reading books, they're interviewing missionaries, they're researching agencies, they're learning about the needs of the world and the problems that exist and what the church can do to be about it. And so they go through this 4-phase process on their own. We've built layers onto that where we have advocates that walk alongside of them. One of the things they need to do is build a support team, not financially, but spiritually, emotionally, physically, a support team that's going to help them with just the little things that they're going to need at home when they go overseas. And so there's some very practical things, and there's some very theological or missiological things. So that's designed to take about 1 year to 2 years to go through. You can speed through it faster, or you can take it at your own pace. But we have a 4-step process that we call the missionary action plan. That is a prerequisite before they pick an agency, and then they pick their agency. Then we get behind them with prayer. We get behind them with encouragement, with finances, big time. And so we try to raise about half of the support for them. But we want half of their support to be raised by friends and family and other churches. We just don't want all their eggs of support to be in one church basket. And so we really want them to diversify their support beyond River Valley. But as their home church, we want to get behind them big time. So we try to do about half of their support financially. So that gives you maybe a little bit of a snapshot there.
No, that's really good. I think every church needs a missionary pathway. You call it action plan, pipeline. They need to think about, what does it look like from the moment that person says, I feel I'm called, or maybe you're proactively tapping a guy on the shoulder and saying, have you prayed about, calling? I see something in your life. But what does it look like from that point to walk them through a process? I think it's really important for churches to think through that type of a framework. I want to circle back to one more thing, and then I want to open it up to the audience here. There's a few questions I'm going to get to, but once again, this is your opportunity to enter into the dialogue with Justin. But something I want to circle back to, Justin, is you talked about dreaming big in terms of mobilizing the whole congregation. And one of the things we talk about at 1615, because we have that passion as well, how do you mobilize the whole church to be involved in the mission of God, as opposed to the missions department or the missions team or the missions minded few? And we love the metaphor of handles. How do you provide vision handles that allow everyone in the congregation to grab on, regardless of age, skill set, income level? How do you allow them to grab on? And as you were sharing an experience there at your church, I was reminded of a church we coached years ago. And one of their focus areas was a Bibleless people group. And as a part of that, that strategy to reach them, obviously, they wanted to translate the scripture into the heart language of the people. And they had money in the line item for missions in the church budget, but they had this value or conviction to do church-wide mobilization. So in my interaction with the missions and elder team, I said, you could just pay it out of that fund, but you would be taking away from the congregation an opportunity for everyone to vest themselves into this initiative to bring the scriptures to this people. And so they said, let's take the total cost of translation, Justin. Let's divide it by the number of verses in the Bible, and let's do a one verse campaign. And they had children breaking open piggy banks.
Yeah.
So you could sponsor a verse or 10 verses, but just using creativity to dream big, to get the whole body involved. They raised triple the amount needed in a third of the time. And I believe it's because it was this rally cry that everyone had a role to play. So just a simple idea for those listening, handle. Think about making the vision accessible to everyone in your church.
Yeah, one of the key roles that I see that I have is to influence the influencers. I've got a sphere of influence. There's people that like me. There's people that probably don't like me. But I know that there's leaders in our church, whether they're paid, whether they're on staff, whether they're volunteers, whether they're elders. Obviously, our lead pastor is key and central to that. But they're not the only leader. They're not the only influencer. So I'm constantly trying to get the heart of our key influencers in our church passionate about the Great Commission, because I know if it moves from just statistics in their head to their heart, God's going to give them creativity. God's going to give them ways to apply this Great Commission vision to their context, whether it's our young adults, whether it's women's ministry. Literally the meeting right before this was meeting with women's ministry to talk about how missions is going to be represented at our women's conference. So, and they set the meeting. So I didn't set the meeting. They came to me and said, we want to talk about missions at our conference. How can we do that? And so we're dialoguing, brainstorming. Well, that didn't happen back in the day. Back in the day, I had to reach out to them, and now they see, man, when our women get a bigger vision for their life and God's purpose for their life than just their community group, and say, no, we're on mission for something bigger. It just brings life and lift to the whole conference and to the that department. And so I'm looking not just for the leaders with titles, but for the people that have influence over pockets of people. Yeah. And I'm telling them stories. I'm peppering them with questions. I'm trying to exemplify it from my own life and how it's enriched my walk with the Lord, how it's opened up my eyes and heart and family. So, I think anything that you can do to influence the leaders in your church by just modeling it. And if it's not in your heart, pray that God puts it in your heart more and more. It's his heart. And so as you spend time with him and see the world and the needs and the opportunity, your heart is definitely going to enlarge, and then just share that with other people.
Yeah, I just want to build on what you said there. You talked about the women's ministry and how you integrated, a global component into their upcoming event here. And I think one of the roles of a missions pastor, whether you're lay or, staff paid, is how do I build relationships with people of influence, as you mentioned. Sometimes they have a title, sometimes they don't. But to serve them and develop an integral vision, like how can I serve you and help your constituency, whatever that looks like, children, youth, women, to connect to a larger vision for the world. I really love that. So I like the idea of an integral vision as opposed to a siloed vision. So here's 100%. One really simple here, but I'm a part of a small church. What are some small steps that I can take to get things moving?
Yeah, like I said, when I started, we were just a single site, relatively small church. I grew up at a church where, an average weekend was maybe 100, 200 people. The staff was very small. That's the context in which I grew up. But we would bring in missionary guests pretty frequently. We would pray for them. We would give of our offerings to them. And so, and maybe you don't have the resources to bring it in, but share missionary biographies. I can't tell you how many books I've bought and just handed out. I think this is a shameless plug, but when everything is missions, Matt, you can correct me, but I think I've bought a couple hundred copies of those and given those away. I literally, I think it's maybe 500 copies, and I need to place another order, but I give books away that have impacted me like candy. Devotionals, that are all peppered with missions thoughts and a missions lens, because I think, they can tell the story better than I can tell the story, but if I've read it, it's been impacted me. So maybe you don't have the resources to bring in a missionary, but get a book that's $5, get a book that's $10. I contact the author oftentimes and say, can you give me a discount? Because I want it to stretch as far as I can stretch. And sorry, Matt, if I'm not trying to.
That's okay. We'll do it. We'll discount it. We'll discount it.
Okay. But I just want to get it into the hands of as many people as possible.
Yeah.
But you can model it, you can inspire it. And I started as a part-time missions pastor 15 years ago. And the thing that I told my lead pastor, I said, missions is my passion, but whatever you need me to do to help build the church, I'm in. If you need to be part-time this and part-time that. So it wasn't until probably about 6 years ago that I went full-time missions. Up until that, I always wore a couple hats. And we were already about 6,000, 7,000. So I actually looked at that as a benefit because I knew the passion that was in my heart was going to influence the other ministry that I was responsible for. So small groups, they were going to get a dose of missions whether they wanted it or not. Adult ministries, they were going to get a dose of missions whether they wanted it or not, because that was the area of influence and responsibility that I had been given. So no one's better than a missionary to tell the story of what's happening around the world. And so whether it's biography or missionary coming in, let the story be told.
That's good. So what advice, tips, guide, resources would you give a church that thinks missions is mostly local? How do you help them get a vision for the globe?
Yeah, I think it's an education thing. Barna's done a lot of great research. Others have done a lot of great research that the majority of people in the church, number one, don't even know what the Great Commission is. Mm-hmm. Number two, have no idea that there's still unreached people groups, let alone 6,000, 7,000 of them, let alone 42% of the world that's still waiting to hear that Jesus loves them, the disproportionate use of resources. So I think it's that humble posture of educating. Yeah. And it's over and over and over. It's stories, it's studies. Barna just came out with a great new study, The Great Disconnect. Back in 2018, they did a great study on the Great Commission and how few in this generation and how few, and even in the next generation, could even tell you what the Great Commission is. And so, not to be a shameless plug, but my wife and I started this thing called Project 42, and we have a whole page just on stats. We have a whole page just on advocate resources. So how to share the story, videos to share. Joshua Project has tons of resources. The traveling teams has great resources. There's a lot of great resources out there. If you just start Googling unreached, the story I tell is, I don't know if we have time to get into it, but one is not more important than the other. Local is not more important than global. Global is not more important than local. You just have to understand that the context is very different, and the access to Christian resources and to the Christian church is very different. And so just like one kid isn't more important than the other, but if one kid has so few resources that are helping that kid, and you're just piling resources to the one that has all kinds of resources, that doesn't make sense. And that's what we're doing right now. Less than 1% of our church resources are going to the unreached. That's unacceptable. That shouldn't be the way it is. We should move the pendulum of resources, both in missionaries and in finances and in awareness. So I think a big problem is education and awareness. And that starts, if you're not aware, you got to make yourself aware and then help educate the influencers and the leaders.
Yeah, there's a phrase we use at 1615 all the time. Knowing comes before doing, and it shapes and informs the doing. And I think there is such value in knowing the heart of God, knowing the state of the world, and let that inform then the actions that you take. So I just really want to reinforce that. We're going to do one more question. We have a lot. I just can't get to them. And then I'm going to have you just exhort and address those who are online, just a word of encouragement. So the last question, very simple, very practical. How is your leadership team, your missions leadership team structured? What roles and responsibilities do they have? Great question.
Yeah, so like I said, when we were smaller, one single site, it was me as a part-time. And then I had a very part-time assistant, like administrator, that helped with just a lot of practical things. The team has now grown. We have 9 on our team. So I've got somebody that kind of manages day to day, so I can focus on vision and inspiration and communicating. So we've got really kind of a day-to-day manager. We have somebody that's over all of our requests. So we get about 500 missionary and organizational requests, so that they're vetting those, and that's put into a rubric that we have that helps us analyze whether that's going to be a good fit or not. We have somebody that kind of oversees our care of missionaries, so connecting with them, caring for them. We have 3 people that are in the area of short-term teams, so they help administrate their global team managers. So they're managing that short-term experience. We have a couple people that are part-time in the area of fundraising. So what we call kingdom builders, it's our above and beyond giving to projects and initiatives globally, locally, and for the next generation. So we have a couple people that help with that. Storytelling, we work very closely with our media comm department, creating videos, creating content, stories, books, so that the story gets out to the church. And then we've got somebody that just oversees our missionary action pipeline. So helping people figure out, am I supposed to be a long-term missionary or not? What does that even mean? What does that mean for my family, or if I'm single, or if I'm retired, or so we've got somebody that's over that. And then we got a couple of people that help out with more administrative things, but are just really the backbone of our department. So that's kind of how it looks. So my role is really now more just vision, inspiration, communication, teaching, problem solving, structure, strategy. That's what it looks like at River Valley.
It's great. Well, it gives people some ideas for sure. And of course, everyone needs a team that's endemic. They need to know where they're going and then organize the team and build the program areas around the vision. I know a lot of people just take a template for a team and it doesn't work. Your structure of your team, the organization of your team needs to align with the vision that you're trying to fulfill. Yeah. So really good stuff there, brother. All right, this is your time. Michael, I'm going to have you pop back up here. We're going to ask Justin to end with an exhortation here, and then you can give closing remarks, Michael. So Justin, stir up the hearts of those who are online here today, brother.
Yeah, the last thing I'd say, I started with the joke that my name is Pastor Mack Daddy or whatever, but my grandpa, I remember right before he passed, my dad called him and, or my dad called me and said, Grandpa's in the hospital. He's probably doesn't have a lot of time left, but he wants to talk to you. And so we had a great conversation. My grandpa was my hero, great storyteller. And I remember the last words that my grandpa ever spoke. So as he encouraged me, loved me, prayed for me, as he was handing the phone back to my dad, I overheard him say his last words to my dad. He's like, I love that boy with a big, big love. And I'll never forget that. That was over 12, 13 years ago. And because I knew it was coming from his heart. He wasn't just flippantly, no, I love that boy. The last words of Jesus were coming from the center of his heart. And that was to go into all the world and preach the gospel, Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria. It wasn't an either or proposition. It was our local community and the ends of the earth. If he chose those words as his last words, knowing those were going to be his last words, how important is it to us that we should care about our community and the ends of the earth? If we don't, we're not reflecting the full heart of God. We are reflecting just a very small part of that heart, and we want to reflect the whole thing. And so I would say if that is a passion that burns inside of you, don't grow weary in doing good. Keep putting fuel, keep putting planting seeds all over the place, all over your church, wherever the Lord gives you influence and opportunity to share the story and the passion. Pray for illustrations, pray for more stories, examples that you can do that will stir people up, but don't grow weary. There is a big world that needs the passion that God's put in your heart. So just keep it blazing, keep it going, and allow God to just grow it in his time and in his own way.
Amen.
Awesome. Thank you, Justin and Matthew, both for your time and taking us through this last hour. It's been fantastic. A lot of practical stuff. And folks, we know there were a number of questions that weren't answered. And I would recommend coming to our National Church Mission Leaders Conference in September in Orlando. You can find that information on the website. There's going to be over 25 workshops that will apply to the local church missions context. And a number of questions even that I saw here online I know will be addressed during those workshops at that conference. Take advantage of the early bird rates while you can. Inflation's on the rise. We have to save money. And so make sure that you take advantage of that savings. Don't wait to the last minute to register for the conference. And lastly, don't forget about August 3rd with Mimsy Robinson. We really want to celebrate the diversity in the missions community. And when you hear about what this church in Harlem, New York is doing around the world, it will be an inspiration to everybody. So make sure you jump on that call on August 3rd when we'll see you next time. So thanks for being with us today, Justin, Matthew. Thank you. Have a great day, everyone. May God bless you. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.